Welcome to another Running on Air video. In this one I'll be revisiting ring modulation and comparing it to frequency modulation. I'll be trying to demystify the maths so that anyone can understand what's going on. Generally a synth will either have one or the other, but not both. But with the release of the Korg Op6, both is now an option, making this a good time to understand the difference. With that said, let's get into it. So with ring modulation, you actually have to have a ring modulator, and you feed both your oscillators directly into the ring modulator. There is no carrier and modulator as such, but in terms of discussing it, sometimes it's useful to think of it in those terms. So you feed both of your oscillators into your ring modulator, and then you get your ring modulated output. With frequency modulation, it's simpler. You literally just feed the output of one oscillator into the control input of the second oscillator, and then the result is what comes out of the second oscillator. So let's look at what happens to the waveforms when we do ring modulation versus frequency modulation. I'm going to start off with ring modulation. So in this diagram here, the white waveform is the modulated output and the blue waveform is the modulator. Now essentially ring modulation is a type of amplitude modulation, but with a difference. So let's just go through that now. So what we're expecting here is that the positive half of the modulated waveform, we expect the output to get louder as the modulator gets higher and then get quieter as the modulator gets lower. But the modulator actually hits 0 volts and then it keeps going. With amplitude modulation, it would just stop and you get silence and that's it. But with ring modulation, the modulator then starts to flip over the modulated waveform. And so you end up in a situation where you get an inversion. Although the output is getting louder again, it's actually an inverted form of the original. Let's have a look. So we've got a standard carrier here, just a sine wave, and then we've got a modulator which is a lot slower in this particular case, so more like an LFO. And then when you modulate them, as you would expect, the peak of the LFO gives you a higher frequency, and when it reaches its lowest point, then you get a lower frequency on the carrier. So in this particular example, it's more like a vibrato than a full-on frequency modulation, which is what we're trying to do. But it's good just to see kind of what's happening in slow motion before we go on. Let's have a look at it from the point of view of the frequencies. So with ring modulation, although we've been looking at it from the point of view of carriers and modulators, they are actually interchangeable, and we'll look at that a bit more later. So if you have a look at this diagram, then we take our two frequencies and we put them into the ring modulator, and what we get out is a combined highest frequency, whichever is the highest frequency, plus the lowest frequency added together, and also the highest frequency minus the lowest frequency. Now the other thing that's worth noting with ring modulation is that the carrier frequency is not there. It's gone. It's been eradicated by the process of the ring modulation. Now if we were doing amplitude modulation, which I covered in a previous video, then the carrier would still be there, and that's the fundamental difference between amplitude modulation and ring modulation. And frequency modulation is different again. So let's move on to that. So with frequency modulation, the carrier frequency is back, but then we get these side bands which are similar to ring modulation in the sense that you've got your carrier frequency plus your modulator frequency, and you've also got your carrier frequency minus your modulator frequency. But the series continues at lower amplitudes. So you also get your carrier frequency plus 2 times your modulator frequency, and you also get your carrier frequency minus 2 times your modulator frequency. And the level of those sidebands is dependent on the level of your modulator. So basically, the louder your modulator is, your sidebands will be louder, but also you will get more of them as well. So if we actually increase the level of our modulator, we then start getting 3 times the modulator frequency combined with the carrier, both plus and minus, and then beyond 3 times it just keeps going. Now there is a problem though. If you are adding and subtracting frequencies, going up the frequency spectrum, there's not a problem because you can keep getting a higher and higher frequency. But there is a limit to how low you can go in the frequency. And what happens is that at some point you're going to hit 0. What happens then? I'll give you the answer, but I'm not going to explain why in this video. I'm going to do that in a separate video because it's interesting, but it's a bit of a tangent. And I think there's some other issues regarding FM that I want to cover as well, which are probably more relevant in a separate video. So I'll do that, and then I will post a link here once that's done. In simple terms, it's like this. So say for instance your carrier frequency is 100 Hertz and you want to modulate it with 150 Hertz. So if you get 100 Hertz plus 150 Hertz, then you get 250 Hertz. What about the minus? So you've got 100 Hertz and you're subtracting 150. Well, that gives you minus 50. You can't have minus frequency though, can you? Well, you can kind of. But what happens in the practical real world is that you go down to 0 and then you start counting back up again. So we said we're going down to minus 50. Well, and then what actually happens is it kind of gets mirrored back into the positive plane, and so it's 50. So what you end up with is 100 Hertz, 250 Hertz, and the minus section is 50 Hertz. Yes, so now we've looked at the theory, let's actually look at the practical side of things. So I found this really good modular synth software called VCV Rack. With VCV Rack, I've just set up a few things. I'm just going to show you those now. On the top row then, we have everything which is to do with the ring modulation. And then the bottom row is the frequency modulation. So let's do some tests with the ring modulation first. So this is what it sounds like. They're both sine waves. They're going into a ring modulator, and this is the output. You can see on the graph we've got 2 frequencies. So 100 plus 200 is 300, and 100, 200 minus 100 is 100. So we've got the frequencies that we would expect there. Let's try a couple of experiments, see if we can alter the results just by changing a few things. So let's try the amplitude first of all. So I've got the waveforms going through this mixer, but in this case it's not mixing them, it's just altering the levels. So if I pull down, say, the second one and then play, we just get the same result, but it's quieter. And then back to the way it was. And if I do the same on the first one, bring the level down, again it just gets quieter. There's no difference to which harmonics you get or anything else. Now what else can we do? So let's change, let's try changing the frequency of one. I'm going to use an envelope shaper to do this. So I've got this envelope shape here which I'm using for modulations, and I'm going to stick it into the FM input on here. I've already got the shape I want, so let's see what happens. Essentially the output frequencies just get shifted up. There's no change. There's no change of relationship between the two of them. They stay the same distance apart, and they move up and they move down. So how can I actually get something new out of ring modulation? With ring modulation, to get interesting sounds, you have to go beyond sine waves. You have to use other waveforms. So let's go straight for the ramp. We may as well. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, just try it with one ramp. Okay, so we've got the harmonic. So we've got a harmonic spectrum which we'd expect from a ramp. The shape is slightly different because of the adding and subtracting that the ring modulator is doing. So you get a different type of waveform. It's not a typical ramp, which is fine. That's what you want. Let's try that with 2 ramps. See what we get. This is quite interesting because what we're getting is gaps in the frequency range. Now, I suspect that's to do with cancellation of frequencies between the 2 waveforms. So where they correspond, if they happen to be inverted, then they get subtracted. And where they happen to be in phase with each other, then they may be boosted. So we get this sort of missing gapped type effect in the spectrum. Let's try now adding that envelope back and see what we get. So I'm only going to put the envelope on the first oscillator. Yes, so I mean, I think that's more typical of some of the ring modulation effects that we'd expect. And obviously if you change the waveforms, then you're going to get different effects. So you might, for instance, just decide to have the sine perhaps on the first one. Let's go back to that. Okay, so I've swapped over to FM now. We're back to sine waves, and the carrier is 100 Hertz, as we've been discussing. Earlier we were saying that if you had a modulator that was 150 Hertz and then you added a bit of frequency modulation, then we'd get 250 Hertz and 50 Hertz as the side bands, but we'd still have the carrier frequency. So let's try that for reality and see if that actually happens. So I'm just going to increase the modulation a little bit there. I'm going to just put it up to 3 dB and just see what we get. And there we go. You can see 250 Hertz and 50 Hertz as predicted. And I haven't done that before actually, so it's just purely calculated what it was, and there it is. So it is predictable. Let's try and increase the level there. So if you remember on the ring modulation, when you played with the levels, it didn't really make any difference. Obviously, if we change the level of the carrier, then it's just going to get louder and quieter. The entire sound will become louder and quieter. But when you change the level of the modulator, it has a very different effect. So we have that on 3. Let's put it up to 12. Okay, now you can see there's a lot more harmonics being generated at this point. Let's put it up to 24. Yeah, a lot more harmonics and a lot more character change. I'm going to put it up to full, which in this case is 100. And you notice now how we actually have a very even spread of harmonics right through the spectrum. And the only thing is I've zoomed in and you're actually only seeing about 1.5 kilohertz. So I'm going to zoom right out and let's actually have a look. That should be the full frequency range now. And you can see in actual fact, it's not gone as far as you would expect. It's only hitting up to about 2 kilohertz. So let's boost that up a bit. Now the reason I've added this mixer here is not to actually mix, but because I can feed each channel into the next, then I can actually boost by 6 dB each time. And in order to get the modulator to really do everything you want it to do, you have to make it louder than the carrier. Boost this up again, so There we go, up to about 2 kilohertz. So I'm going to give it another 6 dB. Okay, and another 6 dB. And another 6 dB. Yep, it's 12 kilohertz, and then the last one. Right, we're going the full way. So the main point is, if you increase the level of the modulator, you get a lot more harmonics. In ring modulation, no, that doesn't work. It doesn't make any difference at all. It just changes the level. So let's have a look at FM with the envelope shaper. One of the things that's noticeable about FM is that even with just a couple of sine waves, you can still get a lot of different types of sounds. But in the modular setup and in a few of the FM synths, you can actually use other waveforms as well. So let's just check that out. I'm going to try a ramp wave, and I'm going to keep the envelope shaper in there just so that we can get a good sense of it. Certainly plenty going on. Let's try going for the ramp on both of them. I'm going to auto scale this just so it's practically breaking into noise there. Let's try ramping this up as well. Yeah, there's all kinds of craziness going on there. The great thing about that is it's actually really starting to sound like radio waves, and of course FM was one of the technologies which was used in radio, and that's really where the inspiration for using them in synthesizers comes from radio. Electronics. And in actual fact, a lot of the things that you need when you look into FM, most of the time you're looking at articles about electronics and radio, and not about music at all. And so there's things to be learnt about FM synthesis by reading about radio, which is a bit strange. Okay, I'm just going to give that a last boost, and let's just really yeah, I really like that sound. I mean, I can see myself using that, no doubt about it. That's really, really good. Yeah, so hopefully that's given you a better idea of the difference between the two. So I know it's quite mathematical even in its simplified form, and that's not very helpful from a sound design point of view, but unfortunately it's the only way that it can really be explained. And if you learn a bit about the relationship of the numbers, it can help you, there's no doubt about it. I think it's quite clear that FM is more flexible when you're using basic components like sine waves, but at the same time I think there's a tendency for it to get radically out of control fairly quickly. And ring modulation, perhaps there's the possibility of more control, but in order to get the interest then you have to use different waveforms. I'd be interested to hear your point of view on this. If you think there's anything I've missed, then please let me know. If you've enjoyed the video, then please leave a like and consider subscribing if you want to see more of this sort of stuff. Also, you can check out some of my tunes. I'll leave some links at the end. So thanks again, and bye.